can tell you, you think we're dealing with with this, the missiles, this. We had the craziest, most wildest thing happen in the shul. The most craziest, you're not going to believe. A guy came to shul with his wife when we were in the park.
Oh, I heard about this. Let's hear about it.
Yeah, listen to this story. You heard about the missionaries that were in Yerushalayim that got caught, the Haredi family?
Yeah.
You heard about it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, make very sure. I want to learn, but basically, there was a guy during the lockdown when we were davening in the park and people were coming from all over. A couple came and they decided to join the shul or whatever, join the minyan. Turns out, Baruch Hashem, we found out pretty soon that they were in cahoots with this other family. They were also missionaries, and they were trying to infiltrate the community, the Jewish, the shul and this and that. And they got caught. So literally this morning, they packed up, middle of the night, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and they're gone. Nobody knows where they are.
Okay.
I heard about this.
Baruch Hashem. Okay. Good. Let's learn, Chevra. We're on page 79. Let's do the Kitzur for a moment on top of the page. Kitzur. Koiches HaNefesh. The powers of the soul are divided into 2 classes, 2 categories. Aleph, Pnimim, those that are considered internal, like intellect and emotions, and B, Makifim, encompassing, which are will and pleasure. And we explained in the chapter Yisrein ha'oineg b'maile v'harotzin b'toikiv. The advantage that pleasure has over will is in its ranks. It's higher in the person. And maybe you could say it's deeper in the person. V'haratzin, the advantage that will has is over pleasure is in its forcefulness, b'toikif. Now, he's going to now continue the next chapter more about this, and I'll be using more of the English here and together with the Hebrew because I think it'll be helpful to us. And towards the end, I believe, Moshe, you'll see the connection and the relevance of this to the flow of the mimer of the essay, which is the principles of education and guidance. Tes Zayin. Toyarim atzmiyim v'toyara mushalim. Intrinsic attributes and figures of speech, figurative attributes. Right? The Alter Rebbe, in chapter 1 of Tanya, which you've all learned, brings 5 categories: tzaddik, beinani, and rasha. 2 levels of tzaddik, 2 kinds of rasha, and 1 beinani. You look into the Gemara, and he quotes the Gemara in Brachas. How is one defined the tzaddik if he does more good than bad? How is someone defined the rasha, more bad than good? And if his scale is balanced, he's a beinani. That is the name. Those names, tzaddik, beinani, and rasha, in that analysis, in that Talmudic observation and study, is a figure of speech. Then the Alter Rebbe says there is the essence of what a tzaddik and a beinani and a rasha is, and that's what he wishes to explore and does explore in the first 10 to 15 chapters of the Tanya. And he calls it over there Shem HaMushal, like the same word we have here, Toyarim Mushalim, which are figurative attributes. Figure. The Mushalim is the plural of Mushal, literally from the word sho'al, to borrow. It's a term that's used and applied in a borrowed way. It's not the term does not define its essence. Then there are what he calls here, Toyarim Atzmim, from the word Atzmim, he says is intrinsic, from the shayrish of the word is etzem, essence. Terms that denote the essence. So in the case of what the Alter Rebbe says over there, a tzaddik is not someone who has more good than bad. The Alter Rebbe argues and positions that a tzaddik means he's completely and always righteous. He's at a point in his life where sin is not applicable to him, as he explains there. With it, and a Russia is someone who's the opposite. So in other words, it's not about the scale, and it's not about reward and punishment. Those are all true, and what the Gemara says is true. But that's the borrowed term of the word tzaddik. Let me give you another example that makes it very simple. You go on the street, or you know a rabbi, or you know a person, and you say, oh, he's a tzaddik. Is he really a tzaddik? It depends what you mean. If you mean he's a holy roller, and he's a very, very frum, and he's very kind and all that, then he's a tzaddik. If that's what you mean, that's what he is. But if you want to really know if he has still ego and an nefesh abamis, which he probably does, he's not a tzaddik. Right? So we use the word tzaddik in a colloquial way. He's a tzaddik. Do we really mean that he's a level of a tzaddik? Yes, Hillel. Hillel, you're muted.
It seems more than colloquial. It seems that the Tanya itself uses that term differently in two different places.
What are you referring to, please?
I mean, in the beginning, in the chapter 1, it seems like he really defines the tzaddik the way we did, like the Rambam does. And then later, he defines the tzaddik, in great detail as somebody without any vestige of sin, and he tells a whole story about Abaye and like that.
With all due respect, you're learning incorrectly Pshat and Tanya.
Okay.
The Alter Rebbe cites the Gemara. So the citation from the Gemara is the way. One second. Then when he starts on the other side, page 2, right? And once he introduces the Arizal's thinking, he's telling you basically that's what I'm following, and that's what really tzaddik means in my vantage point, in the Alter Rebbe's vantage point. And it's not a contradiction. There's Pshat, Remesh, Drush, and Said, right? So he's not contradicting himself. What he's doing, Hillel, until he gets to the Arizal on side 2 of chapter 1, is he's showing you why the Talmudic analysis and understanding of tzaddik is inadequate. Mm-hmm. Inadequate doesn't mean it's wrong. Inadequate means that if you want to study human psychology and you want to study spirituality, you ain't getting it from a scale. You ain't getting it from reward and punishment. You need to probe further. So therefore, he bombards the Gemara with questions. And all of his questions, you follow? Yeah, very, very important. I hope, please don't be slighted that I said, you're learning wrong Pshat and Tanya, but it's for your betterment.
I'm used to it. I've been married 38 years.
You know what I always say? I have a hard hat. Throw it at me. Shoot it at me. Yes, Moshe.
I just want to go back for a second to the issue about essence. When we speak about essence, when the Rebbe is speaking about essence, especially in this context regarding Chinuch and Hadracha, etc., is the Rebbe here speaking about the difference between looking at a person's essence as opposed to their behavior?
Well,
so it's essence.
He did that earlier in the Kuntris. What comes forth, I don't know yet. Let's Let's study it. But what you just said, he did say that, exactly what you said earlier. And he said if you base it only on behavior, you're not assessing properly the student. So you have to look at the essence. That he said earlier, Moshe. And I forget now which exact chapter, but he said that earlier. You'll reread it, you'll find it. Okay. Tezayim. So Tayarim Atzmiyim and Tayarim Mushalim, intrinsic and figurative attributes. Hapis Gomim Hamitayarim Esarotzin B'Shteres Choyes. The two phrases, the two expressions that we mentioned earlier in chapter 15 that explain what will is, what are they? Ein lecha takif kerotzen. One, there's nothing as forceful as will, and number two, ve'ein lecha davar ha'omed b'fnei ha'rotzin. And there's nothing that can get in the way of will. When willpower, Avi, is operative, watch out. It's going to, like I said yesterday, steamroll you. It's the bulldozer. Okay? These two expressions give us an understanding, mefuret, a detailed understanding, be'ikir inyone shel harotzen, to see what the primary concept of will is, umedida b'tkifas ispashtusa shel harotzen. And it also explains to us the faculties that are below Rotzen. In other words, this is Rotzen. If Rotzen is willpower, and Rotzen is tkifus, firmness, so other powers of the soul are not that way. And he says, including, and you look, guys, he uses the word shalamayla. You see, whether we're talking about pleasure, which is above Ratzon. So Hillel, here the Frierdiker Rebbe is taking the position that Oinig is l'mayla meharatzon. Remember, we spoke about it yesterday briefly. So whether it be the idea of pleasure, which is greater above will, whether we're discussing the soul powers of intellect and emotions, which are below willpower, amazing. He says they all are affected by will. It's fascinating. You know what he's saying here? That willpower can force you to have pleasure. And willpower can force you to understand and can force you to feel. If your ratzon, if your will is so strong, and think about it, guys, if your will is so strong, you're so determined, and you're so driven, you're going to use your brain, and you're going to use your heart, and you're also going to use your pleasure. So although pleasure is deeper in man than will, nevertheless the takifus, the strength, the power, the might, the force of Ratzon has an impact on will, on pleasure as well. That's what he just said. V'hinei b'chol ha'koiches b'li hevdel, all powers, without exception, including the highest of the soul powers in the soul, due to its wondrous virtue and elevated status, although it too, pleasure is a power of the soul, right? It's not the soul, it's the power of the soul. We call this a manifestation of the soul, which is pleasure. Is pleasure the soul? No. The soul has pleasure. Once you say, Yoni, that the soul, the nefesh, has tainuk, has oneg, you're acknowledging that the soul is not pleasure. It has a force, an element, an expression that expresses itself through pleasure. Ad koyach hayoser achrei. The same is true, says the Rebbe, to the lowest of the powers, bekoychas hanefesh, of the soul powers, shukoyach hazrika, the power of throwing something, zrika. Hashayach gam bebalchai. Why is it considered avi the lowest? Because an animal can kick a pebble and it can go flying as well. So koyach hazrika, yoinasin, is the koyach hayoser tachten sheba adam, is the lowest power of man. You don't need a brain to throw something, to kick something. Or you don't need a brain of a human, I should say. Because even an animal can do that and does that. Yeshne mashehem atzmiyim v'yeshme shehem boyim rak bashol bilvad. He says, as it is true of the lowest, the power is a power possessed also by animals, and he says there is these ideas both in essential atzmiyim names, and it also exists in borrowed terms, or in English, a figure of speech. Let's see how he develops it. The difference between the intrinsic characteristic and a figurative one, the intrinsic one is all pervasive. It's all pervasive both in the internal and the external. In other words, someone who is accessing essence, it's an all-pervasive feeling that takes charge of every aspect of your being, from the inner aspects of your being to the to the external aspects. Because there's a term in Chassidus, Chevra, when an atzmi is active, nothing else is active. You hear that? When an atzmi is here, everything else is not here. What do you mean everything else is not here? I have a mind, I have a heart, I have pleasure, I have will. It's true. But it's all coming as a result of atzmi, of essence. So what's the driving force at that time? The essence, the etzem. V'hamushal. Yes.
In that way, would we think of the essence as like being makif all of the other kochos hanefesh?
No, not makif. No. Etzem is not makif. I'm glad you asked. No. There's etzem, makif, and pnimi. Mm-hmm. Etzem is the quintessence. Makif already is a format, a definition. Pnimi is another format and definition. Etzem is the self, the true self. But let's learn a little more, maybe talk afterwards a little bit. V'hamushal, conversely, Moshe, now he's talking about the shem hamushal, the borrowed term, the figure of speech. Hurak hashvo v'dinyan le'echad minyona v'chitzonim v'atvelim. The figurative term is described for the sake of comparison to an external and adjunctive attribute. Let's say, for example, he gives an example. L'dugma, pikchas hashua, the cleverness of the fox. We use that l'chochmas ha'adam when wanting to talk about and understand the wisdom of man utfunasa in his comprehension. He's as smart, as shrewd as a fox. Are we talking about a fox? No, we're talking about a man. We're saying that this person's shrewdness and sharpness is as shrewd as a fox. So we call that in English, I think, a metaphor, right? Here he uses the word a figure of speech, figurative. In Hebrew, shem hamushal. It's a borrowed term. We don't literally mean it. We use the term to express an idea that we wish to express. V'cheinu gam binyan harotzen, says the Rebbe, so this applies to rotzen. The essence extends itself in all of its powers and limbs with great firmness and might, forcefulness because it's rotten, va'adir and strong, to force all the powers, lasis gamashu negativam, even to do something that's contrary to their nature. When willpower is active, like I said earlier, it can force someone who's not an intellectual to use their brain, and someone who's not an emotional to use their heart, and someone who's not into pleasure to be pleasurable. Because willpower rides over everything with its force. Now, he says, and why is that? Because the essence of willpower, that's its nature. So that would be, what he's doing now, he's applying the concepts of etzem and mushal, of essence and figure, in will. So he says the idea of essence in will is the fact that it legislates to every other power of the person in the body, do as I say. Zehu. V'hamushal, what is the baro, the figure of speech, the figurative idea within will? Hinehu rak mashahu hareitzer. He says it applies only to the simple aspect of wanting. In other words, I want. In Yiddish, there's an expression. You ever hear this expression? Next villain. He used to say to the kids, next villain. I want this. My daughter wants a computer. I want to go to Florida. I want this. I want that. So my father in his Yiddish would teach us when we were young. Next villain. You could want. I want. Says the Rebbe, we use this expression want, rutzen, for that as well. Do we mean in that phraseology and in that idea that will as in the term of controlling everything? No. We mean will as a figure of speech, but not that this is the real willpower. Let me just read a few more words. V'hu mushpa mima, next page. V'hu mushpa bima shehachutza loi. The person that wants something, he's impacted by something outside of himself. He wants it because it's pleasurable, or because it's intellectual. Oh, what a beautiful idea. This is contrary to the real idea of will. We explained earlier, Chevra, that real will is an expression of essence, of etzem. This type of will is stimulated by the outside, by what smells good, what feels good, what thinks good, what pleasures good. So it's the outside, the chitzonius, the external, that's prompting this will. That's why this is not real will. Right? I want something. Why do you want it? And why do you want it? Is your wanting because you want it? It's coming from your inside? Or I want it because something stimulates me and therefore I want it. In other words, something outside of myself, something that's not I, causes it. Yes, Yaini.
Okay, so we touched on this a little earlier today. So when you're talking about with the neshama deriving pleasure, right? It has its own thing, but it's not the pleasure of this world. Meaning, it's a different kind of pleasure. We're not talking about that. The neshama has a pleasure for any kind of thing in this world, any kind of physicality in this world. Am I right?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, you're right. Go ahead, but go ahead.
Okay.
You have to finish your point.
Okay, so I'm saying if that's the case, so in what you're saying now about, I'm saying like if that's the case, then how can we, what we're learning now, it doesn't, to me, it just doesn't make sense. Like I don't understand how can we separate the two. Meaning if we are saying that a person has there's a special kind of pleasure that is not in this world. But on the other hand, he does derive something. Something. I don't know if you understand my question. It's hard for me to even to really say the words. But I personally feel this is a steerer from what we're saying about if this in this world there's a pleasure from the neshama, that the neshama actually gets the pleasure from this world.
I don't know if I understand what you're saying, but the little that I do understand, we were not talking in this chapter about the soul getting pleasure from God. That's not what we were talking about. Here,
no, not from God. Not from God. I'm talking about when we're talking about getting this pleasure in this world, things not from Hashem. I'm saying that
we're analyzing here the person, the human being, a psychological analysis. We're not yet talking about anything else at this point.
Okay.
Okay. Let's continue. Gamham, second paragraph on page 81. Gamham mushul derotzon tivelis pashit. Notwithstanding this fundamental distinction, the intrinsic rotzon's great inherent forcefulness and strength desires to express itself. Although, as we said, the figurative will is from outside in, and the essential will is from inside out. And in addition to it being very forceful, its forcefulness is broad. It extends itself all over. When you talk about the figurative, which doesn't have the forcefulness of the essence, and more so, as we said, it's impacted by the outside. Nevertheless, nevertheless, it extends itself. In other words, the Rebbe is saying that although there's the essential will and there's the figurative will, but the figurative will also does its job. In other words, when you say I want, and I want, and I want, although you're not talking about the essential will, it still has a big impact. And there are people that pursue their wants, even if it's not coming from their essence, it's coming from their exterior part.
Okay, so you just answered my question.
Okay.
That's my question. You just answered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next paragraph. Moshe, now he goes back. The educator, in addition to him needing to go slowly with the student, step at a time, similar to raising a child, an infant, where you go step by step. Additionally, the educator has to correct the flaws of the student with advice and knowledge by prioritizing what needs to be dealt with first rather than working at two things at one time. Choose your battles. This is what he says here. Choose your battles. Both when it comes to removing the deficiencies, and also when it comes to strengthening the virtues of the student. Bizman echad. It's simultaneously. Choose your battles. And look at the next paragraph. If the student has two deficiencies, he exaggerates and he's a liar. Beis, kasan v'raschan, anger and his blood boils. The nature of a person is he doesn't see his own faults. But every person thinks he's right, he's righteous in his own eyes. So his will, which will drive these different deficiencies, betake of godly with great forcefulness, that'll get all boiled up and all angry and all exaggerating and all lying. But in such a situation, the educator has to make a choice. Which of the two am I going to first deal with? By the way, it's different. He's classifying Megazin and B'Shakran as one, exaggerating and lying as one, and two, anger and blood boiling as number two. So you find these two deficiencies by a student. Says the Rebbe, don't deal with both at the same time. Choose which one you believe is worse for the student and deal with that. Like you're doing with your kids. Yeah, choose the one that is more dangerous for the character. And the two deficiencies of lying and blood boiling. He should first choose the Rebbe is making here a suggestion. Don't deal first with the lying, deal with the resicha. Because resicha can lead to actual sin. Wasting seed. When you get all into a blood boiling mode, it can cause that for avera, that sin. And it can cause all kinds of other illnesses, i.e., in my own words, stress, heart attack, and stroke. You can lose your body, nefesh and soul, that you'll go crazy. Very, very harsh words by the Rebbe. Rahman al-Islam. Did you ever? I never saw someone write such a thing. That resichas hadomim, blood boiling, will lead to going nuts. That's what he says. Next page, 82. The educator. Hasam daite v'libi say that concentrates and pays attention and organizes an approach to a student bigdima v'ichur with prioritization. What comes first, what comes last. With methods of correction, by supporting and bettering the virtues. Umagam and also deals with Kiyas Vasaras Achsenis, removing the deficiencies. Yeshlo Yisoid Moisid. He has a firm basis. Lekavos, to hope. Letotzois Toivish, for good results. But Toyelas HaChinuch V'Adrochen, the achievement and benefit of educational objectives. So you're probably wondering, and you know Moshe is wondering, what's the kesher? Ma'an Yishmita says Lahar Sinai, to quote Rashi in last week's Parsha Bahar. What's the connection about all these discussion of Tainug and Ratzon, will, inside, outside, essence, and what he ends with? And the answer is very simple. You have to know who the student is and what is his real will. Where is his Ratzon? And the Rebbe then took the time to elaborate on what Ratzon is for you, the educator, to understand that it's not a simple matter of just saying, well, I see that he's a liar. I see that he's nervous. I see he's angry. I see he exaggerates. And therefore, the behavior, Moshe, right? The behavior will create the methodology. Says the Rebbe, no. You have to know his Ratzon. You have to know his Tainuk. Who is the person? Ratzon on Tainuk. Although we said it's not the Nefesh, Hillel, right? There's the Etzem, Makif, and Pnimi. But the Makif is closer to the Nefesh. So Chassidus explains, Hillel, that the Makif is what we call Gilui HaNefesh, manifestation of soul. So in will and in pleasure, there is more of soul there. And you, educator, need to find out about it. And this is his point. This is his point. And the bottom line is a tremendous, very important insight. Don't go for broke in trying to correct every issue of the student. Deal with an issue at a time. And in the example that he gave between anger and Resicha, the Rebbe says it's more important to deal with Resicha before anger and exaggeration. Why? Why? Because of the consequences that can come from Resicha. Whereas he doesn't see that in other words, you get angry, okay, we know that the Klolei Avodah Zarah, we know all the chazals about it, like, but getting angry is like worshipping an idol, but that's not a literal sin. It's not a literal Aveira. Wasting of seed is a literal Aveira. Having a heart attack is a literal problem. And going crazy, having a nervous breakdown, is terrible. Very important what I said when we began. A real good psychological thesis or paper needs to be written on this kuntris in modern psychology, what all this means. Yes, Yonis.
Rabbi, you got to know where the guy's getting his pleasure from. Or where he's getting his schmuck from.
Yes, that's one thing.
What turned him on? What turned him on?
Yes.
No, like when you go to a Hasidic Fabrenner, you hear the guy singing a good niggud or telling an interesting mindset like Rabbi Portier. He just turned me on, that guy.
I want, very good. I want to tell you a short thing and ask you if you see this as what the Rebbe is identifying here or not. So, a girl and boy, they were meeting, and the parents asked her, how do you know he's a Yireh Shamayim? How do you know he fears God? They're having a good time, they like each other, but how do you know he's a real Yireh Shamayim? So she said, I'll tell you how I know. Oh no, I'm sorry. The mashpia, the guide for the girl, for the kala, heard good things about the guy she was meeting, and she said to her, how do you know he's a Yireh Shamayim? So he says, I don't know, she says. I don't know what's going on inside. So she says, tell you what. Tomorrow when you go out, and it was the winter, the sun's coming down, just mention to him the sun's coming down and see what happens. And she does, and all of a sudden, he puts on his jacket, then he takes out his siddur, and he starts davening mincha. Now, is that an example? Is that an example of knowing the Ratzon Ha'adam, the Tainug of Adam, the pleasure and will? Or it's really just about the behavior?
Yeah, it's just about the behavior.
Correct. And the behavior...
I didn't hear his answer. Could you repeat it?
His answer was, it's about the behavior. And the behavior is not demonstrative of what his real pleasure is and what his real will is. And what the Rebbe is teaching us in this paragraph, in this chapter, in the previous one, all about will, and he went into so many intricacies about will, is you have to get to, if you want to succeed and know the real will and the real pleasure of the person. And you could do that by focusing and concentrating and knowing and looking at the essence. In other words, the way you, educator, parent, teacher, goes about studying, the student will be the results. Chevre, it's Rosh Chodesh Sivan, Vayichar Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar. We all camp together. It's Avas Yisrael month. It's Torah month. The way to have the Torah is through Achdus. Hashem should help us that we've had in the last 2 weeks such wake-up calls. First with Miron, and now with in Eretz Yisrael with all the stuff that somehow we need to be more ba'achdus and bring people together. I was in the store yesterday, a popular Svarim store here yesterday, and someone who is a Ben Torah, and I was told by the store owner he has an issue with some of my books. So I didn't know who he was until yesterday, and there was a whole crowd, and we were talking history, and the whole store was electric, and everyone kept quiet, and someone else and I were just going back and forth, and it was beautiful. And I turned to this fellow, because the store owner told me, this is he. This is the guy who has an issue with some of your writings. So I said, sir, I'd like to talk to you, Rebbe Yid. What is it that you're unhappy about? He puts his head down and he doesn't want to talk. I said, okay, would you give me your number? He says, no, I don't want to give you my number. That was in the afternoon. In the evening, I happened to be back in the store, and he's sitting on a chair, comfortable, and he says, you know, you're a nice guy. I heard the conversation. That was very interesting. So now I say, so what do you have against my books? And he starts saying, and then I say, did you read one book cover to cover with the footnotes? No. I said, no, and you're being judgmental. And then he goes on to say, well, 10 Gedolim had issues with Lubavitch and the Rebbe and all that. I didn't answer him because, you know, it wouldn't be good if I had to answer him. So I just left it at that. And I said, we got to get together. Achdus. Achdus. Yidden are suffering, and we're worried about what the Gedolim 30, 40 years ago said about the Rebbe, etc. I mean, like, where are you at? The Jewish people are in a serious problem now, and we need achdus. And I said, that's what I try to do. And actually, some of the yoelis, the Hasidim in the store, who you would never believe read my books, totally in the full garb, with the payas and the hat up and the long bekasha. They speak English. Oh, I buy all of your books. And they start conversing. So they're buying. This guy has a tie. He has a, you know, not a full beard. He's a, you know, he's a yeshivish guy. It's fine, great. And he's mentioning the Gedolim and the issues, you know. And the other guy is saying, hey, so he says to him, he says, what? He says, Rabbi Dolphin takes issues that can be very negative, controversial, and he explains where each one comes from. And you decide. And he heard him. I'm just saying, we're talking about Achdus, you know, it's Rosh Chodesh Sivan. Vayichar Sham Yisrael, we have to do more and more things to do achdus. The Rebbe once said, I heard this from the Rebbe, he said when you come to, he was actually talking about Eretz Yisrael, he said when the Knesset gets together and they try to, you know, don't bring up controversial issues if you're trying to get to a resolution where everyone can agree. Find things you agree with. Of course, there are other times, you know, you gotta talk it out and argue it out. But now is the Zman when us B'nai Yisrael, Klal Yisrael, need to find commonality with each other. And the issues we'll leave for later. Have a great day, everyone. L'chaim, good Chodesh. We'll see everyone tomorrow. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Good Chodesh.
Bye-bye.